lesson here, we're going to be looking at the topic of place promotion. So specifically, we're going to begin by talking about the concept of economic sectors. Then we're going to look at the theory of uneven development. Then move into talking about agglomerations of businesses in particular locations. Then we're going to look at how place itself can become a commodity. And then wrap it up with the idea of the creative class theory, which is one theory for why agglomerations occur in certain locations. So to start off by talking about economic sectors. So this is a system for dividing up all the different kinds of economic activity that might go on in a society, right? We've got companies making all kinds of different stuff, and so we can group them into these different sectors. And the classic theory of economic sectors divides the economy into three sectors. There are some people that will break out from the third sector a fourth or a fifth sector or something like that, but for the purposes of this class, we're just going to look at the classical three-sector model of the economy. So this model says you have your primary sector, which is economic activity that involves the direct extraction of resources from nature. So this is going to include things like agriculture, logging, fishing, mining. Anything that you are taking stuff directly from the natural world is part of that primary sector. And so the primary sector is going to be relatively place dependent. So more so than other sectors, it's going to be dependent on happening in certain places because some of these things you simply can't do if the appropriate resource isn't there. You know, you can't mine for gold in a place that doesn't have any gold deposits in the geology. Now, I say this is relatively place dependent because there's still a lot of other factors that will shape exactly where certain primary sector activity is going to occur and where it's not. So all the gold in the world isn't being mined simultaneously at the same rate. Certain gold deposits will be targeted at certain points, and other gold deposits will be targeted at other points on the basis of political policies that are in place, on the basis of the costs that are involved, on the basis of a variety of other factors. You can see that really clearly if you look at the history, for example, of the oil industry. So you can't drill for oil where there isn't any oil in the ground, but different areas of the world have been the focus of oil drilling at different points in time. The oil industry started by drilling for the oil that was in western Pennsylvania, and then it moved to Texas, became really big, and then the North Sea, and then the Middle East. So it's kind of moved around the world on the basis of things like the cost to extract that oil from different sorts of geological formations. You see that now with stuff like the oil sands in Canada that had been uneconomical to exploit in the past, but then have become so as other oil reserves have gotten drawn down, as well as political considerations of the requirements that governments might put on allowing oil extraction to occur and so forth. So that's your primary sector. Then you've got the secondary sector, which is basically manufacturing. It's taking stuff that was produced in the primary sector and transforming it into finished goods. So it's taking that iron ore that was mined and turning it into steel and then making cars out of that. Right? That's all secondary sector. Or it's taking the corn that was grown in agriculture and turning it into a box of cornflakes that someone can buy. So the secondary sector takes that primary sector product and transforms it into manufactured goods. And it's the secondary sector that we most clearly had in mind when we were talking about the Weber model in our past lesson, where you've got inputs and then your customers that you're selling to, and your location is based on kind of trying to minimize transport costs from those different locations. And then you have the tertiary sector, which is the service sector. So rather than producing physical goods that you're going to sell to somebody, whether that's, like logs in the primary sector or like a finished wooden chair in the secondary sector, the tertiary sector is services. So that includes things like finance, banks that give money to help companies make investments and stuff. It includes advertising for other businesses in various sectors. It includes education. So I'm a worker in the tertiary sector of the modern economy because I'm not providing you with any sort of like physical goods. I'm providing you with the service of teaching you about economic geography and all the other things that I teach in my other classes. And when we talk about these economic sectors, the traditional presentation of it is an evolutionary model where every society goes through this shift from being dominated by the primary sector to dominated by the secondary sector to dominated by the tertiary sector. And so this graph here is an illustration of this evolutionary thinking about economic sectors, that you start out in what this graph is calling traditional civilizations with a economy that's has most people working in the primary sector. And that was certainly true if you look at the United States and how its economy has changed over time. This model kind of fits. So if you go back 200 years, you go back to the time of the Revolutionary War and shortly thereafter, nearly everybody in the United States was a farmer. So that part of the primary sector was this huge proportion of the labor force, a huge proportion of what people did. Only a very small number of people worked in the manufacturing that happened, and even fewer people worked in the service sector at that point in time. Then over time, we had a shift so that people moved out of the primary sector as agriculture became mechanized. You didn't need so many people to be able to produce the same amounts of food, so those people moved out of farming and they started moving into being workers in manufacturing. So by the early to middle part of the 20th century, the secondary sector was really dominant. And so most people were working in some capacity in manufacturing. You still had people in the primary sector, and you had increasing numbers of people in the tertiary sector, but still not as many as in the secondary sector. And then if you fast forward to today, we have an economy in the United States that's dominated by the tertiary sector. So the majority of people in the United States work in some sort of service type occupation. Most of us are not directly producing physical goods that you would see in the primary or secondary sectors of the economy. So we are now a tertiary sector dominated economy. So the United States went through this kind of evolution from primary to secondary to tertiary sector dominating economy, as did other industrialized societies like the United Kingdom, France, Australia. The question though is this a trajectory that every society will follow? Can we then expect that countries that are at a different level of economic development are going to go through this same set of stages and end up being like the United States, just later in time? They're just lagging behind us in this evolution. A lot of discussion of global economies kind of assumes that there's that same evolution that all economies go through. In our next lesson, we're going to be talking about how that might not be an accurate way of thinking about it, that this same evolution doesn't necessarily happen in every society. But this broad framework roughly describes what's happened in the United States, at least. So it's useful to look at that and see how there's this change in what kinds of economic activity are the most important. And that's going to change the kind of factors that shape the locations of these economic activities. And where you locate an advertising business and the things that you take into account when deciding where to put the office for your advertising business are going to be very different than the things that you take into account when you're deciding where to locate a automobile manufacturing plant versus locating a logging mill. And things in other sectors will be based on different sorts of factors. So then the next topic that I want to address is the theory of uneven development. And so this is associated in particular with some economic geographers like Neil Smith and Doreen Massey. And the basic idea underlying the idea of uneven development is that financial capital, so that's money, if you remember our discussion of the different types of capital, if you have financial capital, if you have money, you have to turn that into fixed capital, which is equipment and facilities, in order to use it to produce commodities. So if we're in a capitalist system where you take your capital and you invest it to produce some sort of commodity, you sell that commodity and you get back hopefully your investment plus some profit, and then you reinvest that money in producing even more commodities. We have this cycle of reinvestment and producing commodities to generate even more capital. That's the basic underlying dynamic of capitalism. So if you're doing that, part of what you have to do is you have to take all the money that you've gotten from selling your products, from selling your commodities, and you have to turn that into this fixed capital. Right? Money doesn't make new cars, but a car manufacturing plant can make new cars. You need to build the building, and you need to get the machinery to go in that building, and so forth. And so this fixed capital has two qualities that make it different from that financial capital. So one is that it's fixed, it's in a place. So financial capital kind of exists out in the ether, especially these days when your money, nobody even has like dollar bills equivalent to all the money that exists in the U.S. economy. It's just numbers in bank accounts that exist in the cloud. So that money can move as easily to the opposite side of the world as to just down the street. There's it's kind of detached from place. But of course, fixed capital has to be in a place. You have to have an address for your factory to start actually producing commodities. And once you build that factory, it immediately starts to become outdated. And so you can kind of think of this if you're thinking about when you buy a new phone. And some of you may be the kind of people that like to have the newest and best phone out there, right? With the best memory and the best data connection and the best camera on it and everything else, right? You want the latest and greatest phone. If you go out and buy the latest and greatest phone, right, the best thing that you can get for your money today, it's not going to be too long until an even better phone comes out. And now you're stuck with this phone that's a little bit outdated. Your phone is not quite the best phone on the market anymore because a new one has come out. But of course, if you had waited to buy that even better phone, that would have meant that in the period in between, you couldn't make any calls, you couldn't use any of your apps, you couldn't do anything. Because if you were just saving your money until a better phone came out, and of course if you bought the newer phone, then that's going to become outdated because an even newer phone is going to come out that's even better. So at some point, you got to buy a phone so that you can actually use it. But that phone is immediately going to become outdated. They're immediately going to have a better phone out there. And likewise, that happens with fixed capital. Now, in addition, because that fixed capital has to be located someplace and it has to have an address, and it's not easy to move. It's hard to pack up all of your equipment from your factory and shift it to a new place. It's kind of stuck where it is. You also have to deal with the fact that the optimal location for that production at the time that you build your factory is not always going to be there. That the best location is going to shift to some other location, but you're stuck in this old location with your old factory because you built it, you built what was the best factory in the best place at the time, but now the best location has shifted. And the best location may shift due to external factors. So you built a factory where you were because you wanted easy access to coal that was being mined nearby. Well, now that coal mine is all mined out and coal mining has shifted to some other location. And now it's more costly to bring that coal to where you are. Right? So like external factors like that can make your location less optimal. But also internal factors can make your location less optimal. Because once you've built your factory there, by having all this economic activity going on, that's going to start to drive up costs. Land becomes more expensive once you have a strong economy in that place. And labor costs go up. Right? Your workers start to demand more money, and they know you're stuck there, so they can ask for more money, or else you don't have any workers to work in your factory, and you can't make anything. Whereas some other place may have real cheap land because nobody wants it, and may have workers willing to work for very little because there's not any employers in that area. And that would be a more optimal place to go. Take advantage of that cheap land and cheap labor there. But you're stuck where you are because you built your factory in this particular place. And so you're going to be stuck in a suboptimal place for a while until eventually a combination of the place just becoming less and less ideal for what you're doing and your equipment getting more and more outdated is going to get you to the point where it's worth it to pack up and move somewhere else. And so eventually you're going to be like, all right, can't afford to stay here anymore. We are going to close this down. We're going to sell off and move our equipment. We're going to build a new factory in another place. You know, kind of like with your phone, you'll stick with that outdated phone for a while, but eventually you'll say, all right, you know, my phone, it's starting to wear out because it's just old. Maybe the screen is cracked, so I need to get a new one anyway. So now I might as well upgrade to what's now the newest and best phone. So the same thing will happen with capital. So eventually a business will find it worth their while to move to what's the new, more optimal location for their economic activity. And so this leaves behind this landscape of uneven capital development. So you're not going to reach this kind of equilibrium where everything is in the optimal location and economic activities don't move around. Any line of business is constantly going to be moving, chasing after the most optimal place for it to be located and leaving behind places that are now in a kind of economic recession, that have now been kind of abandoned. There's some old infrastructure hanging around there. There's people there that used to work in this industry and their jobs have gone elsewhere. You're going to have this constant movement of economic activities that create an uneven landscape where you have some places that are economically booming because they're where the investment's coming into, they're the current best place to go. And so people are investing and building that fixed capital there, creating jobs, manufacturing products and so forth. And then other places that have been left behind or never got that development coming to them. So that's the basic idea of uneven development. And this leads to a concept called the production of space. So the effects of this uneven development are to create these economic regions. So places get their economic and therefore their broader social characteristics from the movement of economic activities around to different places. So geography isn't something that exists prior to economic activity, but it's something that's created by economic activity. That the structure, spatial structure of the economy is produced by this uneven development process. So now we want to talk about agglomeration. So this is always a fun word to say, agglomeration. And so the basic idea of agglomeration is that we're going to go beyond the sort of individualistic application of that Weber model that we talked about before. And so when we were talking about the Weber model, we were looking at just one company at a time. Where's the best location for it relative to all the factors that influence its location? So just like one company at a time or one factory at a time. The theory of agglomeration points out that companies in related lines of business tend to cluster together. They tend to concentrate in specific locations rather than being spread out, even if that location is not uniquely optimal on an individual basis for every company. And so we can see a bunch of examples of agglomerations, and some of the ones that you may have heard of are things like the agglomeration of the car industry in the area around Detroit. So that area became the center for manufacturing for lots of car companies and related companies, right? So companies that provide inputs to the automobile industry. They all concentrated in the area around Detroit, kind of southern Michigan area. Another famous agglomeration is Silicon Valley. So we have all of these computer companies, right, doing all kinds of different things in the computer business, all ended up in the same area of California. And that one's sort of even more of a clear example of agglomeration because, computer programming isn't something that has the same physical geographical requirements as like manufacturing cars, right? Because there are reasons why you'd get this agglomeration of cars in Detroit because of access to shipping on the Great Lakes and those kinds of things. But computers could easily go a lot of different places. But instead of being spread out across the country, they've really concentrated in California. But before that, there was a concentration, sort of the first concentration of the computer industry when it first kind of became a thing in the United States was actually what's called the Route 128 corridor around Boston. So we originally had most of our computer companies being located on the opposite side of the country. But then that agglomeration around Boston kind of broke up a bit and companies really concentrated in Silicon Valley in California. So we tend to see this, that companies in related lines of business tend to end up concentrated in the same area, and we call that an agglomeration. And so agglomeration occurs when the balance of centripetal forces, which are forces that pull things together and make it better for companies to be close to related companies, outweighs the centrifugal forces, the ones that split things apart, right, and make it advantageous for businesses to be distanced from related businesses. And so this balance of forces shifts over time. So agglomerations can form and then dissolve, and then form and then dissolve. So I gave already the example that we had the Route 128 corridor agglomeration that kind of broke up, and then this new Silicon Valley agglomeration formed. So agglomerations can form and break up as the balance of those centripetal and centrifugal forces shift over time. So what are all those forces that are bringing companies together and separating them? We can think of them as different types of externalities. So this is a concept that you may have heard about if you've been taking courses about the environment, because it's a concept that's often used to explain pollution and why it's so hard to control pollution. But here we want to look at it in a much broader sense. And it was economics where the concept of externality came from. So in this broader sense, an externality is an effect that one person or company's activity has on others without being paid for. So if I do something that benefits you, but I can't force you to pay for it, you are benefiting from an externality. Right? Something I'm doing is benefiting you, and you're getting it for free. You don't have to pay me for it. Now, the tricky thing about that is, of course, that I then have no incentive to provide that externality. If you're not paying me for it, then I don't have an incentive to make sure that you get it. I may create that externality anyway because it's worth it to me, because whatever I'm doing still benefits me enough. But it's kind of a side effect. You're getting this free bonus. On the other hand, if I'm doing something that negatively affects you, but you can't force me to compensate you for it, that's also an externality. So it's still not getting paid for, but in this case, I should be the one paying you for harming you in some way. But if you can't make me do that, then I'm now benefiting from this externality. So centripetal forces tend to be positive externalities. So you want to locate close to related businesses if you're going to pick up this positive externality from being close to them. If you're going to get these free benefits from being located near businesses in related lines of business. And so some examples of some of these positive externalities you can get are, so first, reduced transportation costs. So if you're close to your suppliers and your customers, it's easier to move goods back and forth between you, and so that's going to be a big advantage. You also have shared infrastructure. So businesses in the same line of work often need similar sorts of infrastructure. You might need roads or railroads to move your products in and out on. You might need power lines to supply large amounts of energy for the whatever it is that you're doing. You may need access to water lines and sewers, a variety of sorts of infrastructure that you might need for what you're doing. And it's easier to tap into already existing infrastructure and share that than to build separate infrastructure for each business in whatever place it happens to be in. So if a big highway has already been built through an area, you can get lots of businesses taking advantage of that highway, running their trucks on that highway. And so they share in that infrastructure rather than having to build separate highways for each one. Another positive externality is skilled labor. So we often talk about skilled versus unskilled labor in everyday language, but that's kind of a misnomer because there is no labor that's truly unskilled. There's labor that doesn't require formal, like university training, but it's not unskilled. You still have to learn how to do it. And a person that's been doing it for a while is going to have skills at doing that work that a brand new person that hasn't worked in that line of work is not going to have. And that goes even to, the standard example of an unskilled job is flipping burgers at McDonald's. Well, that actually takes some skill to do that well, to do it quickly, to satisfy all the customers. It actually takes a little bit of skill. You have to learn what you're doing. And so someone that's worked at McDonald's before is going to be a more valuable employee to another McDonald's location or to a Burger King or a Wendy's than someone who's never worked in fast food. They've developed a certain amount of skills. So if you're located near other businesses doing related sorts of work, you can take advantage of all the training that they give their employees if some of their employees quit there and come over to work for your business. So if you are able to get employees who are former employees of your competitors or your suppliers and customers as well, you can take advantage of their training, you can take advantage of their human capital that they built without you having to pay for it. If I get a person who has never worked in my industry and hire them in my business, I have to train them. And so that's a cost to me, whether it's a monetary cost to pay for a training cost or just a cost in the sense of them being less productive until they get the hang of things than they would have been if they already knew what they were doing. So I don't have to pay those costs if I can grab employees that worked in the same type of business for another company. And I can do that more easily if we're located close to each other. It's a lot easier to persuade someone to quit one job and move to a different job if their commute is still the same than if they would have to move to the opposite side of the country to do it. You also get agglomerations forming through spin-off companies. So you may start with, a few companies in an area, but then those companies may have spin-off companies. There are people working for some of those companies that may see a opportunity to be entrepreneurs to fill a niche in the economy that's not currently being filled. And so they may leave that company and form their own company to fill that niche. And maybe the spin-off company may actually be doing business with the owner's former employer. They may spin off a company to provide something that their former employer needed but wasn't able to do in-house. And when you get spin-off companies, they tend to stay in the same area as the parent companies that they spun off from. So that adds to this agglomeration. And then the last positive externality that I've got on the list there is political cooperation, because there are a lot of different sorts of local policies that can affect businesses in that area. And there are a lot of regulations, for example, that the local government might put out that might be either good or bad from the point of view of the people running certain sorts of companies. And the more related your line of business is, the more possible local ordinances might affect you in the same way. And so if you've got a whole lot of businesses in the same area, all doing the same kind of work, they can cooperate politically to lobby the local government to get local policies passed that favor them, right? Whether that is labor laws or environmental laws or tax laws or zoning laws, any of these things that could affect a business, that could add to or relieve them of whatever costs that they have. If you've got a lot of businesses with shared interests in the same place, it's real easy to lobby that local government to put a lot of pressure on them to make them feel like, well, they're dependent on this sort of industry, so they better not do anything that's going to disadvantage that industry, whatever other good effects that ordinance might have. So and you say, well, we're not going to insist on cleaner water because that would upset all of these businesses in our town that are all working together, because they all will benefit from being able to put more pollution in the local waterways. So whether that's good or bad for the location, depends on the situation. But the idea here is that all these companies, because they're related companies and are affected in similar ways by possible local regulations and ordinances and stuff, they can cooperate politically to get a good deal for themselves. So those are some of the centripetal forces that bring an agglomeration together, that lead to lots of related companies being located in the same place. But then you have your centrifugal forces, your negative externalities that push companies to leave the agglomeration and go locate somewhere else, either totally separate from each other or kind of jumping into a new agglomeration, like the movement from the Route 128 corridor to Silicon Valley. So the classic example of a negative externality is pollution. So it might be nice sometimes for a company to be able to pollute the local environment because that saves them on waste disposal costs. But at a certain point, that pollution can actually become harmful to the other businesses around. Even if they don't care about the environment for its own sake, it may be harmful to businesses to have a polluted environment. The workers there don't like it. It may corrode their equipment if the water becomes acidified, and it all depends on exactly what kind of business they're in. But that pollution from having a lot of businesses in the same area could become a negative externality, could push some of these companies to move away from this location. You also have saturation of the market and intensified competition. If you've got all these businesses doing the same thing in the same place, then you're competing for customers, you're competing for workers, and that intense competition is going to cut into your bottom line. And so you may want to move to some place where you're the only game in town so that you don't have to deal with that intense competition. You also just have the drag on economic activity from that outdated fixed capital. So that goes back to the uneven development idea, that eventually you want to relocate to a better place where you can rebuild your fixed capital with the sort of latest and greatest that you can get. So over time, agglomerations will become less optimal for the businesses that are located there. And then the last one that I've got on the list is labor costs. So if you have a whole lot of businesses in a certain line of work in the same place, it becomes much easier for your workers to organize into unions. And so you see that in places like Detroit and the surrounding communities. You had at the height of that agglomeration, when that was the place where all automobile manufacturing in the United States basically was happening, you had very strong automobile worker unions there. And so the basic idea of a union is that it's an attempt to even out the power relationship between the employer and the worker, because in a lot of cases, the employer holds way more power, and they can offer a certain wage or salary to a worker, for example, and if the worker doesn't like it, the company said, well, I've got 5 other people lined up who would like this job, so if you don't want it for that wage, I'll give it to somebody else. So the worker has very little power to demand higher wages or better working conditions, workplace safety or benefits or various other things that a worker might want. So the employer, the company, has a lot of power, and so they can cut their costs quite a bit by giving a pretty bad deal to the worker, just enough to make it worth it for the worker to keep showing up to work, but not a penny more than that. Okay, so if you have this really big power differential between the employer and the employee, and so one way to get around that is if you individually are just so indispensable that the company can't afford to tell you to take a hike and find somebody else. But that's comparatively rare. Few people are that uniquely qualified that companies can't afford to take a pass on them if they ask for too much salary or whatever. A more common thing that you see is unionization, where the workers get together and say, all right, we are all collectively going to agree that we will only work for such and such a wage, for example. And so that way, the company can't say, well, if you won't work for that wage, I'll hire somebody who will, because there's nobody left who will work for that. All the workers have agreed among themselves that they're going to make the same demand. So the company can't play them off against each other and is forced to give them this better wage or, again, better working conditions, better benefits, all kinds of different things that the union contract might ask for. So the longer an agglomeration is in place, the stronger unions are able to become. But from the company's point of view, that's a cost to them. They would rather go someplace where the workers are disorganized, can be played off against each other, are willing to work for a lot less. And so eventually the cost of moving to a new place ends up less than what they would save by getting these cheaper workers, and so they'll move out of the agglomeration. So we're seeing in the United States a movement of a lot of these car companies from the Detroit area to places like Alabama or Indiana, where union membership is much lower and the economy overall was not as prosperous, and so people were willing to work for less. And so these companies have saved a whole bunch of money on their labor costs by moving to these places where there are lower labor costs and less unionization. So one of the things that we're seeing here is that capital, and the owners of these companies, the people that have the money to invest in the capital side of economic production, is increasingly footloose. So this is the term that gets used a lot, is footloose. So it's globally mobile. Capital can move easily to different parts of the world. And there's a number of reasons why that's increasingly the case in our world today. So one is that transportation costs have decreased. So in our previous lesson, we were talking a lot about transportation costs as this major factor affecting location of economic activities. Those transportation costs have gone way down over the last, say, century. It's become so much easier to move goods from one part of the world to another. So just look at where the stuff that you use every day comes from. We use huge amounts of stuff that was manufactured in China or the Philippines or Mexico. We have, fruit that's brought to our grocery stores from Chile and Australia. It's so much easier to move stuff around the world. So those transportation costs become less of a factor in deciding where to locate your economic activity. So it's easy to move to other places on the basis of other sorts of factors. For example, labor costs. You can move far away for cheaper labor and not end up just having that trade-off with the transportation costs, so that you come out even. You come out ahead because the transportation costs, though greater, are so much lower. You also have the fact that we're shifting into this more tertiary sector-based economy, and tertiary sector activities are less dependent on the specific characteristics of the place that they're located in. So the things like an advertising agency doesn't depend so much on the specific qualities of the city that its office is in. And we may be seeing right now, as a result of the pandemic, a even bigger shift to things not even having to be located in one specific place if people can work remotely. So that makes it, again, easy for capital to go where it wants to go because it's not tied down to needing specific kinds of places necessarily. And then we also have increasing free trade agreements. So if you go back, 100 years ago, you find that it's very difficult for capital to move across international borders. So both the home country will have restrictions and regulations on export of capital. They won't let you just take your money and go to another country with it. And then the country you may be wanting to take your money into may have restrictions on the amount of foreign capital that can come into the country. It was very common in the past to have a lot of these kind of rules because countries wanted to protect their own economies. And they didn't want people taking money out of their economy to go invest it somewhere else. They wanted to keep it invested domestically. But they were also worried about foreign investors coming in investing and basically taking control of their economy. And they wanted to keep their economy based on their own people and their own wealth. So it was difficult to move capital across national borders in the past. But over the last half century or so, we've seen lots of free trade agreements established that lower those barriers, that make it way more easy for an investor with money in one country to invest that money in some sort of productive activity in a different country. So it's real easy to move capital across borders these days. On the other hand, people are a lot less mobile than capital. It's a lot easier to move money across the world than it is to move a person across the world. So these people are your workers, right? These are laborers. They're people looking for jobs, but it's not so easy for them to move across the world in search of a job as it is to move money across the world in search of an investment opportunity. And so there's a bunch of reasons for that. Part of it is simply the pure cost of moving. It's expensive to move to a new place. You have to, pay for moving vans and stuff like that. You have to pay deposits and stuff on getting a new apartment or buying a new house. It can be kind of expensive to move. And so that hits especially hard for people that are already on the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. So sometimes people will say, well, if the economy in, say, West Virginia is really depressed, but the economy in North Dakota is booming, why don't all those people from West Virginia just move to North Dakota? Well, expensive, and if you're an out-of-work coal miner, you don't exactly have a lot of money to spare to move to a totally different state in hopes of getting a job, especially if you have to move before you get the job. Second, people have social, cultural, and emotional ties to the places that they're living in. So you tend to form friend networks that are local, and having friends that are physically close to you is important. They can play a role that people that you are like your Facebook friends on the other side of the world can't play. Right? So you can socialize with friends who are distant from you. But if you need somebody to, for example, give you a ride to work because your car isn't working this morning, friend on the other side of the country can't do that for you, but a local friend could. If you need someone to babysit your kids, friend on the other side of the world can't do that, but local friends, or their like teenage kids could do that for you. So having a local social network is very important to people. You are kind of on your own and face some difficulties if you move to a brand new place where you don't know a lot of the people there. You also have cultural connections to place. So the place that you're living in, you probably know how to live there. You know how things work. You know how to get along with people. You know the customs there. A kind of extreme example of this, of course, is language barriers. If you're going to move to a place where people speak a different language, that can be extremely difficult. If you don't already know that language, if you're an adult, it's very difficult to learn new languages. People's ability to learn new languages drops pretty significantly kind of in your early 20s or so. And so, for example, I last summer took a group of students to China, and in the lead up to that, we found out that we got this grant sometime in February, and then our trip was in July. So in the time between that, I was like, all right, we're going to go to China. I'm going to study Chinese. So I got several different apps on my phone and some books, and I was like really working at trying to learn some Chinese so that I'd be able to talk to anybody while I was in China for 3 weeks. And I didn't get very far. I worked at it, but I didn't manage to learn enough Chinese to really have a conversation with any of the people we were there. I became totally dependent on Dr. Wang, who was co-leading this trip, to do any talking to people, to read signs and menus and stuff. It was real hard to learn Chinese, and I've continued to study since then because I'd like to be able to speak this. I'd like to be able to go back to China and do more research there and stuff. And it's tough because I'm 40 years old and my brain does not learn new languages very easily. So a language barrier is kind of an obvious reason that it's very difficult for people to move to a new place. But other sorts of cultural barriers exist as well. Just knowing how people live in a certain place can make a big difference to how easily you can settle in and make a life for yourself there. So I experienced that in my own life because I grew up in Pennsylvania. So I'm very used to how life in Pennsylvania works. Then for a few years, when I was finishing up my PhD dissertation, I moved to Arizona because my wife had a job down there for a while. And even just moving to Arizona, so the opposite corner of the United States, was a big culture shock. Things work very differently in Arizona. The environment is different. There are things that I didn't know. I didn't know how to not get heat stroke down there because when it's a dry heat, I didn't realize how overheated I was getting because I was like, well, I'm not sweating. And I'm used to, here in Pennsylvania, if you get hot, you sweat a lot and you're like dripping wet. Got down to Arizona and I was like, well, I'm not sweating, so I must not be very hot until I like collapsed from heat exhaustion in the dry heat. So there's basic things about life that I didn't know. So that makes it difficult for people to move to a new place. And people also have emotional ties to places. And that's why I ended up back here in Pennsylvania. When I was starting to look for academic jobs, I could have applied to jobs all over the place. There were job ads for all over the country. There were international job ads. I have a friend who was applying for jobs around the same time, and he ended up at the National University of Singapore because he thought they were offering him the best deal on an academic job. But I had an emotional tie to Pennsylvania. I wanted to come back, if not to Pennsylvania itself, at least to the Northeast. So I was applying to jobs in addition to the Slippery Rock job that I obviously got, I applied in like Baltimore and Boston, upstate New York and stuff. But I was really focusing on that area because I really wanted it to be back in the Northeast. That's kind of, my identity is tied up in being somebody from this part of the country. So, and if I were to lose this job, if they were to start cutting jobs here at Slippery Rock the way that they recently have at places like Indiana and California in the Apache system, and I were looking for a new job, I would be looking not just at comparable academic jobs in various places, but I would also give consideration to non-academic jobs that are in Pennsylvania so that I could stay in this area. Staying in this area is important enough to me that I would be willing to potentially move out of academia, work for, the Forest Service or something, as opposed to taking an academic job somewhere else. So people have emotional ties to place. And then there are also legal restrictions. And so, again, that's most obvious in the case of international movement of people. There are immigration laws that restrict people from just moving to whatever country that they want to move to. And that sometimes creates problems because there may be businesses with job opportunities that want workers, and there's workers in another country that want those jobs, but immigration laws prevent them from doing that. So, for example, in the United States, we're having a shortage right now of agricultural workers, people to like pick strawberries and stuff, because immigration laws have prevented a lot of people from Mexico and Central America who in the past would have come in to do that because we've had a tightening of our immigration laws over the last few years. Those people can't get in to do that work, both coming legally and people who would come in illegally and then take those jobs. It's gotten much harder to do that, and so we have strawberries rotting in the field because you can't get the workers over to pick them because of these legal barriers. But even within a country, there can be legal restrictions that make it hard to move from one place to another. So when I was living in Arizona, I said my wife had a job down there and she is a lawyer. So when we moved down there, she sat for the Arizona bar exam and then passed the bar so that she was allowed to practice law in Arizona. When we moved to Pennsylvania, her Arizona bar license didn't automatically transfer over because admission to the bar is a state level thing. Each state has their own bar association that evaluates lawyers to see if they're allowed to practice in that state. And so she had to take some time off from working to study for the Pennsylvania bar and take the bar and get certified to be able to practice law in Pennsylvania. So, if we were to move, she would want to stay within Pennsylvania because she would be able to continue doing her job, continue practicing law. If we moved to a different state, she would have to, either take another state's bar exam, which would be expensive and time consuming, or move into a different line of work that didn't require admission to the bar for that. So these kind of legal restrictions, which I gave the illustration of lawyers there, that can happen with any job that has any sort of certification to it, teacher certifications and hairdresser certifications, all those kind of things. There can be barriers to moving between states because one state won't accept another state's qualifications. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that people are less mobile than capital, that it's harder for people to move to where the jobs are than it is for capital to move to where the investment opportunities are. So that means that places and the people that live in those places are dependent on attracting capital investment. It's easier to get capital to come invest in your place than for all your people to just go to where capital is investing and where the jobs are. And the owners of the capital know this. They know that they hold all the cards in this situation and that they can make all kinds of demands and requests of places in order to get their investment to come into that place. So that has created this phenomenon of commodification of place. So places become commodities sold to these investors. So you're living in a place, you want jobs in that place, you have to basically sell your place to investors as a place that's going to be ideal for them to build a new factory, build an office, bring their economic activity and their investment to this place. You have to convince them to buy your place, essentially. And a lot of times the goal here is to get an agglomeration started. If you can get some key companies to come in and they start putting out spin-offs and they start making it creating these centripetal forces, they'll bring in other companies as well. And so you can see an example of that in Pittsburgh with Google. Pittsburgh worked really hard to get Google to open an office in the city with the idea that that would start to create this agglomeration of tech companies in Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh had been an agglomeration of steel manufacturing, and that broke up and went away. And Pittsburgh was in several decades of kind of economic doldrums through the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s. And the city's kind of idea of how to revitalize their economy is to create this technology agglomeration. And so getting a company like Google to open an office was a part of that. And so to do this, to sell your place to possible investors, is something that's done by what we call a growth coalition. So growth coalition is a network of stakeholders that work together to attract this investment. And so the components of a growth coalition, it's going to be, the details are going to be different from location to location, but it usually involves local government, city, county, and so forth, governments that want to bring in this investment. It includes existing companies in the area who want more economic activity to happen. If you are a restaurant in Pittsburgh, it benefits you if you get other businesses coming to Pittsburgh, because then their people will move here and eat at your restaurant and so forth. So other companies will want to sell the place and get more investment coming in. It can include non-governmental organizations, so civic groups, community development organizations and stuff see benefits to getting investment from capital coming into the area. And it can even include unions. So in a previous slide, I was emphasizing the kind of antagonistic relationship that can exist between capital and unions, right? Because, you think about something like a wage, right? The higher the wages are, the better it is for the workers, but the worse it is for the company, and vice versa. So there's a sort of inherent antagonism there between the workers represented by the union and the company that's paying them. But at the same time, unions also recognize that if the company goes away and the company's not there, then nobody has a job. And so unions can be part of this growth coalition, trying to get investment so that jobs get created for their members to work in, and for workers that they could then organize and bring into their union. So you get all these different stakeholders that want to work together to sell investors on bringing economic activity into a certain place. And so the members of this growth coalition will not just make the case for the location and try to talk it up, but they'll make improvements to the location, they'll make changes to the place that are really driven by what's going to attract investment. And this might not necessarily be what's the best for residents in that place. So the interests of the existing residents may sometimes get sacrificed in order to make the place more attractive to investors who are going to establish new companies and stuff, because the idea is that, well, getting those companies in is more important. And this involves a lot of active marketing. It's not enough just to have a place that would be good for investors to establish companies in. You have to sell them on it. You have to reach out to them. You have to put your place in front of their eyeballs so that they see your message and decide to come. And so that works like advertising for any other product. Right? So this is turning your place into a commodity, into a product just like any other. So, McDonald's puts millions of dollars every year into advertising because they don't want to wait for people to say, I'd like to have a hamburger. I wonder where I could get one. They want to put that in front of your face all the time so that you already know where you want to go for your hamburger. And so places have to do the same thing to investors. They have to really push the idea that this would be a great place to establish a company. This would be a great place to invest in. And then this is all driven by the threat of competition. The places are competing with each other to get this investment to come in. So if my place doesn't offer a good deal to these companies, then they're going to take their capital elsewhere. If Pittsburgh doesn't do a good enough job of selling investors on the benefits of investing in economic activity in Pittsburgh, those investors are going to go to Cleveland instead, or they're going to go to San Francisco, or they're going to go somewhere else. So there's this intense competition between places to sell themselves to these investors. And so I think this is really captured well by this article from Clickhole, which is a parody clickbait site. And this is a few years ago when Amazon.com was looking for a city to host its second headquarters. And so they had this very public competition among cities for who's going to get to host this HQ2. And so Clickhole kind of summarizes the feeling about this here. It says, Jeff Bezos, he's the head of Amazon, of course, just tossed a nail-studded baseball bat on the floor between the mayors of Pittsburgh and Kansas City and asked who really wants the second Amazon HQ. So it's capturing this idea that cities are willing to go to all kinds of extremes, including things that may be, a little unethical, a little horrifying, if it will get these big companies to invest in their city and bring the associated economic activity and jobs into that place. So obviously, most real companies aren't going to decide where to locate based on, a physical fight like that. So instead, what is it the cities are going to offer to companies to try to attract them? So they can talk up the intrinsic qualities of the site and situation that the city is in. So that can include things like having a suitable climate and local natural resources for whatever line of business the companies they're attracting are in. Cities often talk about their proximity to other locations of importance. So a lot of cities pitch themselves as being centrally located, as being in between lots of other things. So you come here, you can easily get to all these other places where your suppliers, your customers, and so forth may be located. Also often talk up having land and labor that are low cost. And we've mentioned that earlier in the lesson, that companies like to go to places where their costs are going to be low, where they can get lots of land real cheap to build their facilities, where workers are willing to work for less because it's the area is sort of economically depressed. People don't have a lot of other opportunities for better paying jobs, and cost of living may be very low, so they can afford to work for less and still pay rent and put food on the table and so forth. So these are some of the intrinsic qualities of the place that might get talked up in trying to sell this place to investors. You also have offering favorable business deals. So a city can promise that if a company locates there, they will give them special treatment. They will make this location more attractive to them. So that can include things like building infrastructure. So, if you come and locate your business here, we will build the highway that you need to transport people and goods to and from your facility. We will build the power plant that's going to be needed to power your factory and so forth. As you offer this infrastructure. You can also offer low regulations. And so that may involve actually cutting regulations in order to attract businesses. Right? So you can say, well, come to our place because the cost of compliance with our regulations is low, that you don't have to meet such stringent standards that you might have to meet elsewhere. So it's going to be more attractive for your business to be located here. And you can straight up offer them money in the form of tax breaks. So one of the reasons that a city government may want to get new businesses coming to that city is because it increases their tax base. And a lot of cities like Pittsburgh have big problems with their tax base, that they have a lot more infrastructure to maintain through the city budget as compared to the amount of money that they're bringing in from taxing the people and businesses located here. So you want to have these businesses so that you can bring in more money from taxes. But of course, businesses don't want to pay these taxes. So you may offer them a deal that you're going to give them big tax breaks. And often these are kind of introductory offers, whereas like for the first 5 years, no taxes on this new business. As that, of course, gives up potential tax revenue. But the idea is, number one, the business will hopefully stay there beyond 5 years, and so you can tax them later. And number two, the economic activity they generate will increase incomes and therefore taxes for other people. So you may not be taxing the company directly. You're giving up on that source of tax revenue. But for example, their workers that they've brought to this place will now go out to eat all the time. And so your local restaurants will be making more money and therefore be paying more in taxes. So you have these kind of indirect boosts to taxes, even if you give a upfront tax break to the actual new company that has been brought in. And so, the competition among cities means cities offering bigger and bigger, more and more generous tax breaks to these companies, to the point that they're undercutting a lot of the potential benefits of getting the company there, but they have to do it because otherwise the company won't come at all. They'll go someplace else that is willing to offer the big tax breaks. You also have places selling themselves on the basis of the amenities that they have for the company's staff. And in particular, this is usually focused at the white collar staff, the managers and owners and stuff, who are the people that are going to move to be at this company, as opposed to more blue collar workers. They tend to draw from the local population. The people that are already there will come and work in those kinds of jobs. So you want to make your city an attractive place that these white collar staff will want to move to and live in. And so that can partly involve things like the climate of the place. And a place like Pittsburgh is at a bit of a disadvantage because our climate isn't the most attractive to lots of people. People would rather have the weather in Phoenix or Miami or something. But you can talk up other sorts of things. So places often make a big deal out of their culture and history. And they talk about the nightlife that they have. They talk about their sports teams as a big draw for why you should move there. They talk about historical sites that they have, in the sense of being connected to interesting historical events that have happened there. And in this category, we also have the green reputation of the city. So a big part of a lot of these pitches to investors is the idea that this city is on kind of the cutting edge of environmental sustainability. And so if you come here, you will get to live in a pleasing environment, that you'll have pretty trees and clean air and stuff around you. And you can then market your company as environmentally friendly, because you can tap into this green reputation that this city has. And, because you're located in this place, people will take you to be an environmentally friendly company, and that will be good for your sales because people, customers will like that. So you have a lot of this this building up of a green reputation, and in practice, it can often be greenwashing. There's a lot of debate over whether some of this this stuff has a real basis to it, or if it's if they're making a bigger deal out of it and hiding the problems. and so forth. But this is certainly a thing that has been attractive to many investors, is the idea that you're moving to a place that has this environmentally friendly kind of reputation, environmentally friendly practices there. So one of the effects of this is that all these cities are trying to market to the same investors, and the investors want the same things. So the cities are marketing themselves in very similar ways. They're making very similar cases for what's great about their city. But at the same time, they have to claim that all the things that they're offering are unique to their city, because if it's not unique to my city, why come there rather than all the other places that are offering the same thing? So places become kind of uniquely the same. So every place is claiming that it's unique for having all these characteristics that every other place says that they also have. So you have to claim to be unique, even though what you're offering is basically the same as everything else. It's kind of a Coke and Pepsi kind of situation. Both want to claim that they're totally unique beverages, even though they're basically the same thing. So then the last topic that I want to talk about here is the theory of the creative class. So this is a idea that is created and promoted by a guy named Richard Florida. And his idea is that cities will have more vibrant economies, and so therefore they will generate new businesses. They'll become the heart of an agglomeration, especially a tertiary sector kind of agglomeration, when they have a lot of people in what he called the creative class. So this is people working in technology and arts types of occupation. So if you have this large creative class, those people are going to generate innovation. They're going to be open to new ideas. They're going to be entrepreneurial, and they're going to help to generate this agglomeration of businesses, and therefore also attract in a more investment. And so there's a number of different ways that you can assess the size of a city's creative class, and I highlighted one of them on the screen there to show kind of the intersections between these economic factors and other social factors. One of the common proxies that people will use to evaluate the creative class in different cities is their gay and lesbian population. And so the idea here is that discrimination in many industries has kind of pushed LGBTQ people into certain types of occupations, that it's easier to be out as a gay person or a trans person or whatever if you're working in the arts, for example, or if you're working in technology, computer programming stuff, than if you are, say, a steel worker or in some of these other types of occupations that aren't part of the so-called creative class. And so if these occupations tend to get more people into them who are LGBTQ than if you can measure the population of that group in a city. That gives you kind of a proxy for this creative class. So cities have taken up this theory. It's become a very popular theory within these growth coalitions. So they love Richard Florida. And so cities have tried to act on this theory. So if having a big creative class is going to spur economic development in your city, then you should cultivate a large creative class. And so cities will do things like creating an arts district to try to encourage artists to come to your city and to come together, where you can all be exchanging ideas and seeing each other's art, and this will kind of drive this growth of this creative class. Now, there are a number of criticisms of the creative class theory. And so some of the criticisms are strictly empirical criticisms that are going into the statistics of, is there actually a correlation between the size of the creative class in a city and its economic development, and evaluating different ways of measuring this creative class, and does that make a difference to whether the theory adds up? And that's a complex literature, and the best summary I can give is that it's maybe, that there's the creative class theory is neither like obviously false or obviously true, and you can dig into the literature on that if you are really interested in this idea. But in addition to empirical questions about how well this adds up, there is the kind of political criticism that the creative class theory ends up being a way for cities to try to more efficiently meet the needs of capital, potentially at the expense of other considerations like the needs of the workers in the city or the needs of the local environment. So if you are focused, like a laser on boosting your creative class in order to attract investment, other things can get left behind. So you can end up creating a lot of economic inequality between these creative class workers and your other workers in your place that you're not helping, that you're not favoring because you don't see them as the route to economic growth. And it can fuel gentrification. So gentrification is a process that an area that is sort of a lower income neighborhood will get bought up by developers and turned into housing and amenities, stores and so forth that are aimed at upper income people who will then come into that area, and the lower income people will then get displaced. They'll get pushed out of that neighborhood, they'll get sent somewhere else. And the place they get sent to might not be as good of a place for them. It may have less access to transportation, less jobs in that neighborhood, and so forth. So gentrification can cause some problems, but this creative class theory encourages cities to do things, to implement policies that can exacerbate gentrification in the hopes of attracting this investment to their place. So that brings us to the end of today's lesson, and I will see you next time.